women painters are all the rage today. From Artemisia Gentileschi to Tracy Emin, the topic can hardly be said to have been neglected. And perhaps surprisingly, there's nothing new in this. The debate about women's opportunities in art goes back a very long way, at least to the lady in white at the centre of this picture, Adélaïde Labille-Guiard, shown painting a portrait of Vien in a canvas by one of her pupils, Gabrielle Capet. She's the one looking out at us, holding the palette. Normally in Munich, it's on show at the moment in an exhibition of femmes peintres at the Musée du Luxembourg in Paris. Much of this debate is about sociology rather than art history, but the reason why it's of interest now is not because of the biases and obstacles of the past, nor even whether any of those survive today, but because some of these artists were, notwithstanding the barriers, good painters. Let's celebrate them as such, not as victims, and let's do so properly for what they created, not because they were women in some second-rate tier. And in this better-known example, the tables are turned. Here, Labille-Guiard is painting herself. It's worth remembering, as I pointed out in a blog 2 years ago, with new facts about Labille-Guiard and her family, that this painting is only in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York because it was rejected by the Louvre in 1878 as sans valeur artistique. Incidentally, the third figure in this picture, Marguerite Carole de Rosemont, another of the famous 9 all-female pupils, remains so obscure that even her name was misspelled until my recent research identified her as the illegitimate daughter of Swiss farmers. Incidentally, her name continues to be misspelled in the Femme Peintre exhibition at the Luxembourg. She was 20 at the time of this portrait, and one of the reasons why none of her work has survived was that she got married and died in childbirth a couple of years later. You can read her story, and those of a great many women pastelists, in my online dictionary at pastelist.com. As usual, if you want any more details about the pastels in this film, or facts and references about the artists, please go to the site where the articles and essays are all freely available. Both these large-scale group portraits verge on the territory reserved for history painting, strong statements of the ambition to be recognised in this higher genre than mere portraiture. But it is in straightforward portraiture, and in particular in pastel, that women found it easier to make their mark. No elaborate studios are required, and teams of apprentices to move heavy equipment. Here, for example, is the earliest pastel we have from Gabrielle Capet, made when she was just 20 and had recently started to study with Labille-Guiard. This pastel, incidentally, once belonged to Labille-Guiard's biographer, Anne-Marie Passet. And here's what Gabrielle Capet's teacher was doing at the time. At first glance, you might think it's just what the 18th century pastel was all about. Pretty girl, vapid expression, nice frock, silly hairstyle. But if you get over that, I think you can begin to see what is so special about Labille-Guiard's art. Much modern academic writing focuses instead on her full-length oil portraits, where there is more to discuss, the work in pastel being reduced to a stepping stone. That, I think, is to miss her real significance. In the uncomplicated poses of these bust-length portraits, she depicted her aristocratic, and sometimes plain, subjects to best advantage in the splendid costumes of the day. The silks shimmer, the muslins, ribbons, feathers and flowers are invariably exquisite. But this is achieved without pyrotechnics. No virtue is made of vigorous hatching, nor are the chalk strokes stumped into oblivion. Faces are smoothly rendered, with mouths in particular, captured with the solidity of chiseled stone. Everything confirms her mastery of colour. But Labille-Guiard never loses sight of the reality of the personality she is depicting. The flamboyant outfits of the late 18th century fashion can deceive. Understated serenity rather than vapidity is the true characteristic of these masterpieces of the art of pastel. 18th century France was blessed with an extraordinary number of brilliant portraitists, but most followed Mathieu, the peintre des femmes, in distinguishing male subjects who received the traitement psychologique from females whose vacuous expressions were denuded of personality. Even Perronneau's female subjects are less interesting than his men. Labille-Guiard's supreme achievement was to find a way within this tradition of depicting women as individuals with real personalities. What emerges is often an extraordinary dignity. That individuation, already evident in the Getty's so-called l'heureuse surprise, or happy surprise, is what keeps that picture the proper side of the portrait-porn divide. There is perhaps another surprise worth noting. You will all have heard me explain the unique suitability of pastel as a medium for depicting flesh. It captures perfectly the texture and translucency in a way which oil painting, with its shiny varnishes, can only imitate. You might therefore think it would be ideal for painting nudes, the type of picture we call galant in French, or licentious in English. While there were numerous such miniatures, and a good many gouaches and prints, curiously very few pastels were explicitly pornographic. Among the rare exceptions were the works of one Monsieur Salmon, whom you can look up in my dictionary. His Femme nue dans une posture indécente was among the works and tools seized and destroyed by the authorities in 1775, although it is less clear whether the subject matter or the fact that he hadn't joined the guild was the greater offence. Perrin de la Blancherie gave a lengthy explanation of the prudery at the official salon, concluding that the state's moral severity was probably a good thing, all told. So, as we turn to Labille-Guiard's most ambitious work in pastel, which incidentally is coming up for sale in Christie's in Paris shortly in an auction devoted to women artists, there's also one at the other place soon, it is easy to understand why otherwise respected sources have described it as the first modern French painting of breastfeeding. Others confine themselves to the claim that it was the first such shown at the Salon. But actually both claims are wrong, and are indicative of the kind of sloppiness all too often encountered in art history, where theories are discussed and debated endlessly without troubling to research the facts. Of course, this picture neatly fits into what people want to think about Rousseau, but let's just correct this. Labille-Guiard herself had exhibited pastels of women with naked breasts in 1779 and 1782. In pastel alone, one could mention Perronneau's Madame Poissonnier with the Duc de Bourgogne, it's around 1751, although I suppose you could explain that as the public nature of royal bodily functions. Roman Charity was a favourite. At the 1765 Salon, both Lagrenet and Bachelier had exhibited versions, and an engraving of the Rubens in the Hermitage was even adopted as the emblem of Maurice Condin de la Tour's Masonic Lodge in Saint-Quentin. Again, you will say these are religious pictures, not depictions of maternal affection. But while we can debate whether the National Gallery's maternal affection by Lagrenet was or was not shown in the 1775 Salon, there is no doubt about two lost paintings of Une femme allaitant son enfant, also sent to the Salon, one by David in 1781 and another by Jolin in 1773. But the story of Mme Mitoire et ses enfants is not a question of priority any more than it is about propriety. The complexities that I explored in my recent research were about the sitter, or rather sitters, and the family relationships. You can find more details in the essay posted on my website. For a picture that has been so widely referred to and reproduced, whether in the original pastel or the miniature reduction in the Louvre, it is astonishing that so little investigation had been undertaken into these biographical questions. What was known is that the lady was Christine Geneviève Pron, the granddaughter of Carl van Loo, but to date the Labille-Guiard literature has said nothing about the children and less about the husband. It is of course assumed that Labille-Guiard knew her because of the Van Loo connection, and indeed Labille-Guiard, who was received into the Académie Royale in 1783, the year in which the pastel was shown, was set as one of her morceaux de réception, the oil portrait of Mme Mitoire's cousin, Amédée Van Loo. This portrait, now in Versailles, would in turn be exhibited 2 years later. What hasn't emerged is that Mme Mitoire cherished, until her death in 1842, her grandfather's oil portrait of her own mother, who had died just before her second birthday, giving birth to a sister. It was the only picture she identified in her will, and remained in the family until just a few years ago. At the age of 17, a little older than in this portrait, Rosalie Vanloo married Benoît Bron, an official in the French post office. Christine Geneviève was born 18 months later and is likely to have been brought up principally by her grandmother, Christine Somis, the opera singer who had married Carl Vanloo in Turin in 1733. One of the facts I uncovered about Labille-Guiard's family a few years ago was that her father, seen here in the classical bust by Pajou that you can spot in the background of the triple portrait, and who is described in all the literature as a marchand mercier, running a shop that employed the future Madame du Barry, had actually disposed of the shop by lease to the aunt of another woman painter, Constance Blondelue, Madame Charpentier. He had turned his attention to running a lottery, as well as becoming directeur des postes in Paris. Almost certainly this would have brought him into contact with Benoît Bron, so it's perfectly possible that Madame Labille-Guiard's commission came through her father rather than through the Académie and the Vanloo. Christine Geneviève's grandmother on the Bron side was a member of the Grimaud family that was well known in a number of contexts. They included several financiers with a particular power base in Lyon, and most notably for us, Laurent Grimaud de la Reynière, who was not only a fermier général, but administrator of the French Postal Service. Here's a portrait by yet another Vanloo, Louis Michel. Grimaud de la Reynière was also seigneur of Clichy-la-Garenne, the village which is now a suburb of Paris, where Bron and his daughter lived. Grimaud was an amateur painter and pastelist, so there's an entry on him in the dictionary, and he filled his house in the Champs-Élysées with his famous picture collection. But it was his son, the famous gastronome, Alexandre Balthazar Laurent Grimaud de la Reynière, who plays a crucial role in our story. It is clear that this wayward and troubled youth became infatuated with his cousin, and his father had to have him exiled to try to control his errant behaviour. The son, nevertheless, continued to write a stream of letters to Christine Geneviève for years afterwards. We can never fully establish what happened, but Grimaud fils confided a version of his story to the licentious novelist Rétif de la Bretonne, who included it with the girl's identity lightly disguised in one of his novels. It was clear that the 19-year-old Christine Geneviève had to be put out of harm's way, and this is where Mme Mitoire comes in. Charles Mitoire had recently been appointed to a position in the tax collecting service for the Lyon area, although he remained based in Paris. The wedding of Mitoire and Christine Geneviève took place in Clichy in 1779. Among the guests were, of course, Amédée Vanloo, Labille-Guiard's future reception piece. The following year, a boy was baptized and given the names Alexandre Laurent. The 76-year-old Christine Somis, Madame Vanloo, was the marraine to her great-grandson, but it is the parrain who is the bigger surprise, not Grimaud fils, but his father, Laurent Grimaud de la Reynière, the local seigneur, head of the postal service, and the amateur pastelist. Very little is known about this boy, but at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, he was sent out to Martinique to run a fashion shop, and there he died in 1816. A little more is known about the younger brother, whose identity I published a couple of years ago. He was born 2 years after his brother, shortly before Labille-Guiard's pastel, and he became a painter, being trained by Labille-Guiard's second husband, François-André Vincent, from 1796. Despite exhibiting in the Paris Salon, he is omitted from most art reference works, essentially because almost his whole professional career was spent in Russia, where he emigrated, obtained Russian citizenship, married a Russian, and became a member of the Academy in St. Petersburg in 1813. He was in fact a prolific portraitist in oil and miniature, and is represented in the Hermitage and other Russian museums. He came back to Paris and died there in 1832. It is, however, the father, Charles Mitoire, who doesn't appear in the portrait, who is the hardest to pin down. My article, which is so complicated I can't begin to give a précis of it, shows how his family is connected with the business of luxury goods, and in particular the manufacture of playing cards, in which his father had been particularly successful. Unfortunately, he was caught using untaxed paper and prosecuted for forgery, fined heavily, and banned from practicing his trade in Paris. This effectively exiled him. But his wife, Charles Mitoire's mother, took over the business, remained in Paris, and 3 years before her husband's eventual death in Metz, she bigamously remarried. This business would eventually be taken over by the parents of another woman painter, Pauline Ouzou. Charles Mitoire himself had a progression of setbacks in his career. Various documents suggest that he did not live with his wife. His position in the Recette des Finances de Lyon was lost when he accepted a bill which failed, giving rise to a lengthy court case and a debt he couldn't pay. No doubt through his wife's connections, he was then appointed to a position in the post office, but he also lost that when the two parts of the service were merged. He then joined the Menu Plaisir as garde magasin, but even there, the few sightings we have were controversial. He died in 1822, impoverished, separated from his wife, and without an heir. When, 2 years later, Mme Mitoire appeared in the list of state pensions for a modest 400 francs per annum, the justification of the pension was that she was petite fille de Vonlot, peintre de Louis XV, rather than as widow of the garde magasin. Mme Mitoire eventually died in 1842, having outlived her husband, the 2 boys shown in the pastoral, and the girl born 7 years later, who married into a medical family through whom this pastoral and the other family portraits passed down until the 20th century. Labille-Guiard's masterpiece, which deserves to be seen in the context of a dynasty of painters, shows a picture of conventional domestic tranquility that reveals nothing of the turbulent story unfolded in my research.